When my fiancé told me I was basic and that any woman could do what I do, I didn't argue. I simply walked away. 3 months later, he showed up at my door, not with an apology, but with a confession that shattered everything he thought he knew about me. India Morrison had perfected the art of being invisible. At 32 years old, she moved through the marble lobbies of Manhattan's most prestigious law firm like a shadow, always present, never noticed. She carried Preston Caldwell's dry cleaning in one arm and his overpriced coffee in the other, her sensible flats clicking softly against floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. To everyone who passed her in those gleaming hallways, she was exactly what she appeared to be: a personal assistant, probably underpaid, definitely underappreciated, and completely unremarkable. Preston Caldwell, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. At 38, he had the kind of confidence that came from generations of wealth and the assumption that the world would always bend in his favor. His suits were custom-tailored, his smile practiced, and his last name opened doors that most people didn't even know existed. When he introduced India as his fiancée at firm events, she could see the surprise flicker across faces, quickly masked, but never quite hidden. She knew what they were thinking. She'd heard the whispers at enough cocktail parties to recognize the pattern. How nice that Preston found someone so grounded. She must be incredibly sweet. And her personal favorite, delivered by Preston's law partner after 3 martinis. You're so lucky, Preston. She's so low maintenance, like refreshingly low maintenance. India had smiled through all of it. She'd learned to hold that smile the way other people held their breath, something you did to survive uncomfortable moments. She managed Preston's entire life with a quiet efficiency that he'd grown to depend on without ever quite acknowledging. She scheduled his meetings, remembered his mother's birthday, edited his speeches to sound less robotic, and somehow always knew when he needed his favorite takeout after a difficult day. To Preston, this wasn't extraordinary. It was simply what India did, what she was for. The first crack in their carefully constructed life appeared on a Tuesday evening in October. Preston's college roommate Bradley had flown in from Los Angeles, newly divorced and bitter about it. He'd brought his new girlfriend, a 24-year-old aspiring influencer named Simone, who spent most of dinner photographing her food and dropping hints about the Cartier bracelet she'd seen earlier that day. India watched Preston and Bradley exchange knowing glances across the table, an entire conversation happening in raised eyebrows and suppressed smirks. After Simone excused herself to the restroom for the 3rd time, Bradley leaned back in his chair and sighed. My ex-wife cost me $4 million in the divorce, $4 million. And now I'm dating a woman who thinks $300 is a casual dinner budget. He took a long drink of his wine. Preston, my friend, you have no idea how good you have it. India here, she's like finding a unicorn in the city. Preston reached over and squeezed India's hand, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach at the gesture. Trust me, I know. India's not like other women. She's just simple in the best way. No demands, no drama. She's happy with pizza and Netflix, aren't you, babe? India had smiled and nodded, but that night, lying in Preston's king-sized bed in his expensive apartment that never quite felt like home, she stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of that word. Simple. As if her contentment with pizza was a personality trait instead of a choice, as if choosing not to demand things meant she had no wants at all. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, during a conversation that started about wedding plans and ended with everything in ruins. India had been thinking about the wedding more seriously, about what it would mean to blend their lives permanently. She wanted her family there, really there, not just as background decoration. Her mother, her 2 brothers, her aunts and cousins who'd shaped her into who she was. When she mentioned flying them in from various cities, Preston had barely looked up from his laptop. Let's keep it small, India. Do we really need a big production? I was thinking something intimate, just close friends. These are close friends. They're my family. I just mean, it's a lot of coordination, a lot of expense. Let's keep it simple. That word again. Simple. India felt something shift inside her, like a foundation finally giving way after years of erosion. Preston, I'd like to contribute to the wedding. Financially, I have savings, and I think Preston actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but something worse. A patronizing chuckle that said he found her offer adorable in the way you'd find a child's attempt to help genuinely sweet but ultimately useless. Babe on your salary? I appreciate the thought, I really do, but this is my gift to you. Let me handle it. That's what I'm here for. India stood very still, her hands folded in front of her. I feel undervalued, Preston. The words hung in the air between them. Preston finally looked up from his laptop and she could see the irritation flickering across his face. He'd been working on a difficult case, she knew. He was stressed. But what came out of his mouth next wasn't stress talking, it was truth, finally unfiltered. Undervalued? His voice rose slightly. India, you're a personal assistant. Let's be real here. You're not exactly irreplaceable. I could hire someone from an agency tomorrow who'd do the same job. Probably better, honestly, since they'd actually have professional training. The room went silent. India felt her heartbeat slow, felt herself going very calm in the way she'd learned to do when the world revealed its ugliest truths. But Preston wasn't done. He stood up pacing now, the whine and stress and buried resentments finally finding their voice. You know what your problem is. You people always want credit for doing the bare minimum. I give you everything, a place in my life, access to a world you'd never see otherwise, and somehow it's still not enough. You should be grateful, India. Do you know how many women would kill to be in your position? The words you people echoed in the space between them. India reached up slowly and removed the engagement ring from her finger. The diamond caught the light as she placed it carefully on the kitchen counter, and the soft click of metal on marble was the loudest sound in the apartment. India, wait! Preston's face had gone pale. He could see what he'd done, could hear his own words replaying in his mind. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just stressed. You meant every word, India said quietly. Her voice was steady, unnervingly calm. You just didn't think I'd ever call you on it. She walked to the bedroom and packed a single bag with the essentials. When she returned, Preston was still standing by the counter, the ring gleaming between them like evidence at a crime scene. Where will you go? He asked, and she could hear the assumption in his question. He thought she had nowhere. He thought she needed him. Don't worry about me, Preston. I'll be fine. And then India Morrison walked out of Preston Caldwell's life, and the man she left behind had no idea what he'd just lost. The first week without India was inconvenient for Preston. The second week was uncomfortable. By the third week, his life was actively falling apart. He'd hired a replacement assistant, Morgan, a polished Ivy League graduate from one of Manhattan's premier staffing agencies. She was efficient, professional, and utterly incapable of reading his mind the way India had. When he snapped at her for forgetting to remind him about a client meeting, she'd simply stared at him and said, It's been on your calendar for 3 weeks, Mr. Caldwell. I sent you 2 reminder emails. His apartment, he discovered, had been held together by invisible threads India had maintained. The cleaning service stopped coming because India had been the one scheduling and managing them. His mother called, hurt that he'd forgotten her birthday, something India had never let happen. A speech he gave at a firm dinner was stiff and received polite but unenthusiastic applause. Later, a senior partner had pulled him aside. Everything all right, Preston? That wasn't your usual standard. You seem off. But worse than the practical failures was the silence. Preston had tried calling India dozens of times, only to discover she'd blocked his number. He'd driven by her small apartment, the one he'd always secretly thought was beneath her potential, never realizing the irony of that thought, only to find new tenants moving in. She'd vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving no forwarding address, no trail to follow. Late at night, unable to sleep, Preston found himself searching for her online. It was strange. India had no social media presence. No Facebook, no Instagram, no LinkedIn profile. For someone who'd worked in Manhattan for years, she'd left almost no digital footprint. The few references he could find from her previous employers were vague, sealed behind NDAS. One former boss, reached by phone, had simply said, "India Morrison?" She was excellent. Honestly, we felt like she was doing us a favor by being there. I can't say more than that. And then they'd hung up. 3 months after India left, Preston was sitting in his usual coffee shop, numbly scrolling through his phone while waiting for his overpriced latte, when he saw the magazine. It was the latest issue of Forbes, casually left on the neighboring table. The cover made him freeze mid-scroll. The woman staring back at him from the glossy paper was India, but not the India he'd known. This India wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Her hair was styled differently, more sophisticated, and she stood in what appeared to be a gleaming corporate boardroom with the Manhattan skyline behind her. The headline read, "The Silent Billionaire: How Tech Heiress India Morrison Spent 5 Years. Undercover to Understand Inequality." Preston's coffee arrived, but he didn't notice. His hands were shaking as he picked up the magazine, ignoring the confused look from the barista. He flipped to the cover story and began to read, and with each paragraph, the world he thought he knew crumbled a little more. India Morrison was the only daughter of Morris Morrison, the late founder of Morrison Tech, a company that had rivaled Apple in the early 2000s before Morris's untimely death from a heart attack. India had inherited his entire fortune at age 27, a sum totaling $2.3 billion. But instead of joining Manhattan's social elite or taking over the company, India had made a decision that baffled her board of directors and terrified her lawyers. She'd gone undercover. For 5 years, she'd worked ordinary jobs under her real name, which no one recognized because she'd deliberately stayed out of the public eye her entire life. She'd been a barista, a retail worker, a home health aide, and yes, a personal assistant. She'd experienced wage theft, sexual harassment, discriminatory hiring practices, and the thousand small indignities that working-class people, especially women of color, faced daily. And she documented everything. The article detailed how India had used her findings to launch the Morrison Foundation, one of the country's most aggressive philanthropic organizations focused on workers' rights and dismantling systemic racism in corporate America. She'd anonymously donated $800 million to various causes, restructured her father's company to have the highest minimum wage in the tech industry, and was now ending her undercover project to work on advocacy full-time. There were photos throughout the article. India speaking at the United Nations, India in board meetings, commanding rooms full of powerful executives, India at charity galas, smiling beside senators and celebrities. Preston recognized some of the dates, nights when she told him she was visiting family or dealing with personal matters. The family calls he'd overheard had been board meetings. The simple apartment had been a temporary space. The woman he'd called Simple owned a multi-million-dollar brownstone in Brooklyn and had more money in her checking account than his entire family had accumulated in generations. Every dismissive comment he'd ever made crashed over him like a wave. Every time he described her as low maintenance or simple or just an assistant. Every time he'd made assumptions about her intelligence, her potential, her worth. And worst of all, you people. He'd said you people to a woman who was quietly funding civil rights organizations while he'd been coasting on his family's name. Preston's hands were still shaking as he found himself standing outside India's real home 3 hours later. The Brooklyn brownstone was beautiful, understated but clearly expensive, with a small garden and original stonework. He'd had to look up the address from public property records, feeling like a stalker but unable to stop himself. When India answered the door, she looked exactly like the woman from the magazine, poised, calm, completely in control. She was wearing casual clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, but somehow she looked more powerful than anyone he'd ever seen in a courtroom. Preston. Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "I had no idea who you were." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "India, if I had known." If you had known I was rich, you would have treated me better. She didn't say it cruelly, just stated it as fact. That's not growth, Preston. That's just greed with better manners. That's not fair. I loved you. You loved a version of me that you invented. A simple girl who needed you, who should be grateful for your attention, who fit into the box you'd built. India leaned against the doorframe, studying him with something like pity. You never once asked me about my dreams, Preston. You never asked what I wanted to build or create or become. You just assumed I had no ambitions because I wasn't loud about them. Preston felt tears burning behind his eyes. I was wrong. About everything. I see that now. Can we start over? India shook her head slowly. You're only here because you read an article. Because you found out I have money. If Forbes had never run that story, you'd still think I was just some girl who should have been grateful you chose her. She straightened up, reaching for something on the table by the door. But since you're here, there's something I need to give you. She handed him a manila envelope. Inside were documents, transcripts, recordings, documented incidents. Every racist comment made at his law firm, including his own words from that terrible night. Every microaggression, every discriminatory practice, every casual cruelty that India had witnessed and carefully catalogued. I'm giving you a choice, India said, her voice businesslike now. Your firm can become the first major New York law practice to undergo my foundation's complete equity restructuring program. You'll implement blind hiring practices, mandatory bias training, transparent salary structures, and you'll commit to genuine diversity in partnership tracks. Or this documentation goes to the press and your firm becomes a case study in exactly the kind of institutional racism I'm working to dismantle. Preston stared at the papers, his face draining of color. You planned this? You were using me? No. For the first time, emotion cracked through India's calm facade. I was falling in love with someone I thought was kind. Someone who seemed different from the others. I desperately hoped I'd never need this documentation, that I was wrong about you. She paused, her eyes bright. You proved me right instead. India, please. I spent 5 years invisible, Preston. I watched how people treat those they think have no power, no value, no voice. And I learned that respect isn't something you should have to earn with money or status. It's something you give because of who you are, not who someone else might be. She stepped back, preparing to close the door. You saw a black woman in a service position and assumed that was all I could be, all I was worth. That's not a mistake, Preston, that's a choice, and now you have to live with it. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Preston standing on the steps with an envelope full of his own failures. He'd come looking for closure, for forgiveness, for a second chance with a billionaire. Instead, he'd found something more devastating, the truth about who he really was. 6 months later, Preston's law firm became the first in New York to complete the Morrison Foundation's restructuring program. Preston himself stepped down from his position, unable to face the daily reminders of what he'd lost and why. He'd learned something, perhaps, but the cost of that education was everything he'd taken for granted. India Morrison continued her work, her foundation expanding to 200 companies nationwide. She never married, but she mentored dozens of young women of color entering tech and finance, making sure they'd never have to make themselves invisible to survive. And sometimes, late at night in her brownstone with its beautiful garden, she thought about what she'd learned during those 5 years undercover. The most important lesson wasn't about inequality or injustice, though she'd seen plenty of both. It was simpler and more profound. You can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone they think can do nothing for them. Preston had failed that test. But somewhere out there, India believed, was someone who wouldn't. Someone who'd see her, really see her, whether she was serving coffee or running a foundation. Until then, she had work to do, people to help, systems to change, and a world to make better for everyone who'd ever been called simple, told to be grateful, or dismissed as replaceable. Because the truth was, no one was replaceable, everyone had value, And sometimes the people you overlooked were the ones with the power to change everything, if only you'd taken the time to actually see them.